Welcome back into Top Prospects here on Penn State Sports Night. It's been a little bit, but we're back here. I'm Logan Bourandas alongside, as always, by Chris Lemmo. No special guest on this edition, but Chris, it's been a minute.
It's been a while. A lot has gone down since we've last talked. Some good, some bad, but excited to break it all down. And hopefully the lockout won't cause too much of an issue here, and we'll get to do some more podcasts pretty shortly after this.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the lockout towards the end of the podcast. But starting out, because it's been a while since we've recorded, we haven't even really talked about the playoffs in the MLB, and we haven't really talked about the World Series champion as much as me and you both don't want to do it. But the Atlanta Braves ended up taking the title home. They beat the Houston Astros in the World Series. And it was kind of an interesting run for the Braves because they didn't finish out with the best record in terms of other playoff teams, only 88 wins on the season, but were able to beat teams like the Dodgers and the Astros eventually in the World Series. But what did you see in their run?
Yeah, you talk about a lot of times the team that goes in hottest into the playoffs tends to make the most noise. Like you look back at some of those San Francisco Giants teams, I think that's what this team reminds me of. In that on paper, the lineup, like you're going to look back and say, there's no way they should have beaten LA or Houston. I mean, just talent alone, they don't have, in my mind, especially without Acuna, the talent that LA or even Houston had. But again, they went into the playoffs hottest. They had the best chemistry, I think. I mean, everything was clicking. So from that standpoint, looking back, yeah, I look like a complete moron going out there and picking Houston in 6 games. I think I picked against Atlanta, I want to say in every series they played. I mean, and looking back, I'm like, I see why I did it because of the talent on paper. But again, in the playoffs, time and time again, it has showed that that doesn't matter. I mean, they're kind of another team I would compare them to is sort of like that Nationals team that won it all. Actually, I think that Nationals team had more maybe talent, especially on the pitching side, than Atlanta had, but they just went in on a scorching hot run. And sometimes that's just what it takes. I mean, because again, an 80-something win team, they really were not impressive until the last 2 months of the season. But GM Alex Anthopoulos, he deserves all the credit in the world because let me tell you, a lot of people, and I actually don't, I'd have to look back. I don't think I was one of them that said that they should sell at the deadline. They seemed dead without Acuna, but here's the thing, that division was so bad that good on their GM, Alex Anthopoulos, for realizing that, look, as down as that team was around the deadline, they could easily make noise. And sure enough, they did. But it was the deadline acquisitions that did it all. I mean, you look at guys like Eddie Rosario, a couple of those guys that were just incredible. I mean, so from a storyline perspective, it was great to see. I mean, obviously, as a lifelong Phillies fan, it's brutal. But I mean, from a storyline perspective, it was a great story. I mean, losing your all-star player, one of the new faces of the sport, and looking like a team that was going to go possibly even below 500 and winning the World Series is really cool to see.
Yeah, it was definitely really impressive. And I think I was one of those people that had said the Braves should sell at the deadline just because of where they were at that point, where the Mets and Phillies were kind of fighting each other for that top spot in the division. And both those teams had bought at the deadline themselves. So I think looking at what the Braves did, the moves they made at the deadline really was the story of the rest of their season. I mean, Eddie Rosario was lights out come postseason time. You had Jorge Soler, ended up winning the World Series MVP. They got at the deadline as well. Jock Peterson, too. Like, they basically rebuilt their entire outfield within just a couple of weeks in the end of July. Like, that's a really impressive thing to see, really, from any organization. And I think it's just definitely more of an impressive run that the Braves made compared to the Nationals, because at least, the Nationals, they still had their young superstar in Juan Soto. Like, he was still on the roster. Ronald Acuna Jr. was hurt. He got hurt early on in the season, and he wasn't going to be there. Everyone knew that. So it was really impressive to see the Braves take down these dominant teams that have really been together for years. And I mean, a lot of that lineup on the Braves, they had just gotten there. So it's definitely an impressive run to see. And I mean, you don't really see a team with 88 wins make it that far, but they did, and you have to really be impressed by it.
Yeah, I do think that the Giants comparison is probably more fair. And that again, you're going to look back at this team and see like Eddie Rosario, Adam Duvall, like Jock. I mean, Jock Peterson's a pretty big name. I mean, they're all like good players, but they carried the team. Like they played as good, if not better. I think they played better, a lot of those guys, than Freddie Freeman. Like you look back, and that's even like the St. Louis Cardinals, some of those teams. Actually, that's a good comparison. Probably is that St. Louis Cardinals team in 2011 that destroyed my hopes and dreams by beating that like 100, what was it, 200 something win team that the Phillies had in the wild, or no, they beat them in the NLDS, went on to win the World Series. And David Freese will forever haunt my nightmares. But again, it's just role players that absolutely stepped up in the clutch and came through. I mean, it was very impressive what they did. I mean, it was an amazing story. Again, for baseball, it, as much as I hate saying it because it's a division rival, it is better for the sport to see a team that doesn't spend so much money and is always at the top of the payroll, but a team that is smart, goes out there, didn't give up everything at the deadline, and wanted to compete, because so many teams don't want to compete right now. Like you look at Baltimore. I mean, you look at a lot of the lower payroll teams. Atlanta could have just packed it in and said, you know what? We don't have, one, the money to spend like these other teams, and two, you know, we're below 500 around the deadline. We're just going to pack it up and compete next year. So I think it was cool to see that, you know, just from a perspective that we need to see more teams want to compete. And I think that's something that'll probably be addressed in the new CBA that'll hopefully get agreed on soon. But yeah, definitely a good run from the Braves. Now, it seems like a couple of those guys, or most of them, may not stay there. So that Braves roster will probably have a lot of turnover. But, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think that Braves team down the road is still set up to compete. Wouldn't be surprised at all if they went, you know, marched right back, I don't know, to the World Series next year, but went pretty far. But in terms of an NL East perspective, though, it is going to be wild next year. And I'm sure you're itching to talk about that NL East.
Yeah, Chris, and there's a lot of interesting free agency signings that kind of took place over the past couple of weeks before the lockout even started. And I mean, it made for a wild past couple of weeks because players wanted to sign ideally before the lockout happened. And starting on November 15th, all the way to the lockout, we saw a lot of moves take place. And I'll kind of go in kind of like chronological order of when they happen. We'll kind of take a look at both. We'll take a look at all the deals here. But starting out, I'll group two pitchers together who kind of signed very early on, or kind of the first two big names to get contracts. And they happened within a day or two of each other. But Eduardo Rodriguez to the Tigers, $77 million contract. And then Noah Syndergaard to the Angels, a $21 million contract. Both players looking to prove themselves, kind of got different deals, as Rodriguez got a 5-year deal and Syndergaard got a 1-year proven deal.
Yeah, you know, the Tigers are interesting to me. Eduardo Rodriguez, that's probably a decent fit for him just because that park in Detroit is monstrous. It's a great pitcher's park, and I think he'll play pretty well there. The Tigers are a team that is kind of trying to, the Tigers and Rangers actually, I think, are in pretty similar positions. Maybe the Tigers are slightly ahead of the Rangers in their rebuild, but both teams that went into the offseason wanting to speed up their rebuild and got, two pretty big names. Now the Rangers definitely went out and spent more, but from a standpoint of baseball needs more teams competing, less teams tanking, I think it's good to see that, Eduardo Rodriguez went to Detroit. I think he'll play well there. Obviously, we have another guy in, I don't know if I'd call him your guy, but Javy Baez going there, which is kind of surprising. I know that there was some rumors that Carlos Correa might go there. He's still unsigned, but overall, yeah, that was kind of the first moves on the market before everything just unleashed the last couple days in November before the deadline.
Yeah, and especially with the Rodriguez signing, it's really been surprising just how competitive the Tigers want to be. And I mean, it's not like in past years the Tigers were at the bottom of their division. They were 81 and 81 last year. So this is the Tigers team that has the young talent and they think that they can take the next step. Now, whether or not Eduardo Rodriguez is the guy or not, I think that still remains to be seen. But I think he's reliable enough to make that deal worthwhile, and it's a smaller deal compared to some of the starting pitchers elsewhere that got signed. We'll talk about them later on. So it should be I think it'd be a good fit there as what Rodriguez. He'll start out kind of the top of the rotation, kind of move his way down there towards the end of that contract. I think he's always been a reliable pitcher with the Red Sox when he was with them. And Noah Syndergaard, he barely played last year. He played maybe in 2 games because he was coming back from his injury, which has kept him out for quite some time. So it's a risk for the Angels. And this is a team that's lacked pitching pretty much for a long time now. They also added Aaron Loup from the New York Mets, who had an amazing season with the Mets and was probably their best pitcher outside of Jacob deGrom. So if Noah Syndergaard can play well, it's been a while since he played a full season, really at all. I think he's only played one full season in his entire career, and it was an average season. Then the Angels that they'll have a reliable pitcher. I mean, Noah Syndergaard is capable. He's capable of getting high strikeout totals. He's capable of tallying up those innings. I think he'll be a decent fit in LA, and that lineup is just looking for the pitching. And I think that Syndergaard, Loop, maybe another signing or two after the lockout should definitely help out with that. Now, moving on a couple days after those two signings, this signing kind of unleashed a particular owner and what he's capable of doing. But the Cardinals signing Steven Matz, kind of a surprising deal. 4 years, $44 million contract. But I think the big story is what Mets owner Steve Cohen's reaction was to it and what kind of happened with him afterwards in the days after the signing.
Yeah, I didn't really get this one. I mean, honestly, as a division rival, I'd rather the Mets have signed Steven Matz and not signed the guy who we'll get to later. But I don't know. I mean, Steven Matz, like, he's fine. There's not really much else to say about him. Like, I get it from a St. Louis standpoint, but here's the thing. Like, again, the guy in 2017 had a 6.08 ERA and 13 starts. The next season, the next 2 seasons, he was fine. Around a 4, a little over a 4 ERA in 18 and 19. And then in 2020, just a disaster of a season, 9.68 ERA in 6 starts and 9 appearances. So, again, actually, his best seasons were really his first 2 in New York, especially 2016. Like, he's good. I don't know. Considering what else was on the market at the time, why don't you go after a Marcus Stroman to pair with, Jack Flaherty or something? I get it. He's fine, but I don't think that St. Louis needs another end of the rotation guy. I think they need a guy that can log innings at the top of the rotation alongside Jack Flaherty. I mean, Adam Wainwright continues to be very good, but again, he's a fossil. He's 40 years old. All credit to him. He's bounced back after a couple of rough years where it looked like he was done. I mean, he's now the last 2 seasons posted ERAs just north of 3. Between him and Jack Flaherty, they do have a good 1-2 punch, but I don't know. I thought that they would go after a Stroman or somebody like that. Maybe not a Scherzer, but I mean, it's a fine signing. 4 years feels like a lot, especially considering I haven't seen Matz put together really good back-to-back years, let alone, 3 or 4 years that have been good. So I didn't really get it, but good loss for the Mets, I guess, because if there is truth that is what motivated Steve Cohen to go on a signing rampage, then that was a very good loss for them because they got a lot better for that.
Yeah, and personally, when the Mets were rumored to go after Steven Matz, I was okay with it just because of what we saw from him in Toronto last year. He wasn't terrible. Like he was actually putting together a decent bounce back season after the disaster that was 2020 for him. So I was totally fine, seeing him as like a number 4, number 5 type starter, especially with guys like Joey Lucchesi not being back for a little bit and the inconsistencies around Taiwan Walker. And then, you had Marcus Stroman, who was still kind of out there. He didn't know if he was going to come back or not. Obviously, he didn't. So signing Steven Matz wouldn't have been the worst case scenario for the Mets, but going to St. Louis and kind of in just kind of the fashion that he did it, it was definitely surprising because the Cardinals, they kind of panicked for a couple starters at the end of the rotation. They had J.A. Happ and John Lester they acquired in the trade deadline last year. So they were desperate for guys at the end of the rotation. So I think Steven Matz does fill that void for them. He's definitely younger than both those guys, and just the inconsistency I've seen from him. I think he won't really be more than a number 3 starter in that rotation, especially with guys like Jack Flaherty and Adam Wainwright there coming back for this next year. So I think that there's gonna be some questions around that. But just the reactions from Steve Cohen after that signing was made, and just the unprofessional behavior he called from Steven Matz's agent, and pretty much thinking that the two sides had a deal locked up, and Steve Cohen rather thinking that Matz would reunite with the New York Mets. I think just that entire situation was definitely a little really interesting to kind of watch. And Steve Cohen doesn't really use Twitter to he uses Twitter a lot, but not really to burst out his anger. I mean, he's not really the kind of guy to like show his anger on Twitter. He's not the kind of guy to like call people out there. I think that was the first time I've really seen that with him. So it was a new side to Steve Cohen, but that led to, I believe it was around 3 days later, the New York Mets made their first few signings of the offseason, where they signed guys like Starling Marte, Eduardo Escobar, and Mark Canha, all to help out the lineup. And then eventually, we'll just kind of jump into it now. Max Scherzer going to the New York Mets. 4 signings from the New York Mets within just a couple of days to kind of revamp their roster.
So, all right, I guess I'll start out because there's a lot to unpack here with some of the position player signings, and then we'll get to the obvious one, Max Scherzer. So, I liked a lot of their signings. The question for me is going to be not so much, I guess, how do those guys fit in, but then what happens to guys like J.D. Davis, Jeff McNeil, and Dom Smith. So you figure, well, the other question is going to be what happens with Cano, but Mark Canha, that's a good signing. Again, a lot of these guys were 32, 33-year-old veterans that they picked up on like 3-year deals. That seemed to be the theme here. Mark Canha hit pretty well in Oakland. And again, Oakland is not a hitter's paradise by any stretch of the imagination. 26 homers was his career high in 2019. Again, not that Citi Field is really a hitter's paradise either, but he could do a lot more damage there, I think, than he did in the Coliseum. He's definitely more of an on-base threat. You look at his on-base numbers the last couple seasons, north of 350 there. In fact, again, in that 2019 season, that was very good, almost a 400 on-base percentage. He's going to fit in really nicely there. It's not like he's a star or anything, but 2 years, 26.5 mil. So that's a little over 13 mil a year. I think that's a fair price, definitely, for Canha. He was a guy that actually I wanted to target for the Phillies vacancy in left field. I think he'll fit in fine. Here's the thing. Do you think he's that much better than Dom Smith?
I honestly don't think it matters because I think out of all the guys you mentioned, like Dom Smith, like J.D. Davis, like Jeff McNeil, I think it's one of Davis or McNeil to go. I think Smith stays. And you take a look at that Mets outfield now. I think you have Dom Smith, you have Brandon Nimmo, you have Mark Canha. You don't have Michael Conforto anymore because I'm assuming they're not going to try and bring him back. So I think there's already a spot open. And you've Starling Marte as well. So I think the real debate is the Brandon Nimmo and Mark Canha debate if you want to go with one of them for your right field spot. I think either one would be fine as a fourth outfielder, but I think not having Michael Conforto anymore kind of opens a lot more angles for this Mets team to make. I think that out of all the signings the Mets made, I think the Escobar one was the most questionable one for me, just because I would rather have Jeff McNeil or JD Davis compared to Escobar, just based off where those guys are coming from. But I think JD Davis right now is probably the biggest trade candidate, just because he couldn't hit the fastball to save his life last year, and he has been really a consistent player for New York, but he got hurt for most of the season last year, and he struggled with his power numbers, and he just wasn't the same. He wasn't the same during last season, and he's not as good of a fielder because he doesn't really have a set position. So I think that he's probably going to be on the move, and I think that you could see the Mets maybe try to make one more move for a potential star out there. I think they've talked about guys like adding maybe Chris Bryant over free agency, and then maybe trading for Jose Ramirez in Cleveland. So I think there's a lot of options that the Mets can work with. But I think that in the outfield, they're going to be fine, just because not having Michael Conforto opens up so many new possibilities. You can have Dom Smith, you can have Starling Marte, you can have that battle between Brandon Nimmo and Mark Canha, who will help you out in so many potential angles. I mean, Nimmo is great at getting on base, and Canha's also great at that as well, but he has more power. So I think you really have a lot more options in your outfield.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I would, if I'm any team, I would take a flyer on either Jeff McNeil or JD Davis in a trade, because I know that both of them had down years last year, especially JD Davis. They both have showed, I mean, JD Davis has shown, I don't know if both of them, but JD Davis has more pop, I would say, in his bat, with the 22 home runs back in 2019. They have shown that, they could be valuable pieces. I know the strikeout rate last year was alarming for Davis, but he's not old. I mean, he'll start the season at 28. Most of it'll be 29 years old, though. I'm absolutely taking a flyer on him. He's a pretty versatile player. I actually think a team like the Phillies could use him as sort of a backup if the Bone situation doesn't work out at third base, to play him there. But yeah, I think Jeff McNeil is fine, but yeah, I think they're going to start Eduardo Escobar. Again, he'll be 33 years old, but I don't get the dislike for Eduardo Escobar. I mean, you kind of know what he's going to give you. He's going to give you probably 250, 260 and hit, I don't know, 25 homers. Like, he's not an on-base percentage machine really, because he just doesn't walk much, but he's a fine player. I mean, I don't know. I know I saw a lot of people kind of questioning that. He gives you a little bit more stability than what what a McNeil or Davis gives you. So I get what they were going for there. And at 10 million a year for 2 years, I don't think that's terrible. It just doesn't feel like something. It felt like you could have waited and gotten him cheaper later in the offseason than jumping the market and getting him right away. That's really my main thing about that signing. Now, in terms of the outfield, it is going to be interesting because Brandon Nimmo, I haven't really seen him outside of center field. I'm assuming he'd be a fine right fielder. I'm assuming they would put him in right field and Marte in center. I don't know though. Maybe they would have a position battle and swap them. Then Canha has mostly started in left field, so I think he'll start there. Yeah, I mean, that's a good outfield. I mean, that's not all-star worthy, but you have three guys that have career track records that are very solid, that what you're going to get out of them. And it's not like you're starting, Johneshwy Fargas and, hate to say it, but Dom Smith is probably more inconsistent as well. He's very streaky. These guys aren't like that. So that's what they, I think, have kind of gone for, is track record and stability. And that's why you're seeing them sign a lot of veterans, over the age of 30 instead of younger players, so far, at least this offseason. But yeah, the big question will be what happens on that bench. I would be shocked if they go into the season with JD Davis and Jeff McNeil on the bench. I just don't see how that happens, because I'm assuming they're going to keep Cano. I don't think they can cut him without paying that contract.
Yeah, but I think just you know how deep Steve Cohen's wallets are. I think he can afford to kind of cut off Robinson Cano. I think he would wait until spring training just to kind of see what Robinson Cano still's left in him because it's been a year since he's played ML in the MLB. I mean, I think he's played in other different like leagues and stuff like that, kind of overseas, but it's been a while since he's played with the Mets and put up the numbers that he did in 2020. But I think that if it comes to the point where Cano is playing absolutely terrible, then I think Steve Cohen should have no problem cutting him. I think that wouldn't really be a problem. I think he would probably be the easiest guy to get rid of compared to McNeil and Davis. I think that it's probably the more likely option just because you know that Steve Cohen's like insanely rich.
Yeah, I couldn't tell. I couldn't tell how much money he had until lately. Yeah, he's got a bit of money. Pretty impressive what he's done. It's definitely look. I do give credit to them because they realize that this is the DeGrom era, right? He's not getting any younger. He'll turn 34 next season. This is it. They have to win in the next couple seasons while they have DeGrom because after, once DeGrom is done, obviously Scherzer will be done then as well. And then you look at the rest of this lineup that they have now, Cano is obviously old, and I don't really think he figures into their plans that much, but Canna will be 33, Escobar will be 33, Marte is 33. So, a good amount of their lineup is getting older. So I like what they did, obviously not trading away any of what they had in their farm system, keeping, the guys like Brett Beatty, Francisco Alvarez, Ronnie Mauricio, but still, being able to maximize the DeGrom window was definitely key here. They weren't waiting around for a Beatty to fully entrench himself in the lineup. They want to get going now. And if a spot for Beatty or Mauricio happens to open up during the season, then so be it. But definitely an aggressive game plan, as they should be. I mean, DeGrom deserves a World Series ring, or at least, throwing billions of dollars like, Steve Cohen seems, content on doing at getting him a ring because, again, he's not getting any younger. And as this past season showed, you don't know what his health is going to be like. I mean, if you get a full season out of him this year, that's great. But again, you don't know going forward. It just seems like slowly, I think age might be starting to catch up to him. I'm not expecting him to fall off a cliff by any means. He's still the best pitcher in the game right now, and he'll, be fine. But as he gets up there, in a couple of years, yeah, he might start to fall off a little. I don't know that he'll be, like a Kershaw or a Scherzer pitching, as good into his late 30s. But, good on the Mets for maximizing their window now. And I mean, obviously that DeGrom Scherzer 1-2 punches. I mean, can you think of a better one in recent memory in baseball?
I mean, it's really hard to think of it. I mean, these two guys have been battling it out in the NL, not only in the same division, but for Cy Young awards in years past. And I mean, just the amount of hardware at the top of the rotation for the New York Mets is absolutely insane. And I think even like looking back at the trade deadline last year when Max Scherzer said that the New York Mets were one of the teams that he did not want to get traded to because he had that no trade clause. I think after that, at least me, I had no idea that he would consider the New York Mets in terms of free agency. I was not even thinking about getting Max Scherzer. I was thinking about getting, guys like Marcus Stroman, maybe if we're lucky, get a guy like maybe get like Kevin Gausman or someone like that. No, in no stretch of my imagination did I think we would get Max Scherzer on the team. And that 1-2 punch can be fantastic. I think that right now where Max Scherzer's at, he's coming off a year where he had a career low in ERA, and that's with the Nationals and the Dodgers. And this is a guy that has postseason experience. He's won a World Series. He's really done it all. He's done it all in his entire career, and I think he's still in a good point where he can be competitive and he could make a push to be that best pitcher on the Mets roster. So I think that it's going to be a fun duo to watch, and if healthy, they're going to make some noise.
Yeah, I didn't think he was going to go to the Mets at all. I mean, obviously we heard about the West Coast stuff. I for sure thought the Angels would make a run at him. I love the Dodgers, obviously, and they did. I had an outside feeling that the Giants could make a run at him as well. Padres, I didn't know if they had the money, but yeah, I thought for sure he was staying out west. I was really surprised by that. But as Uncle Stevie, as I know, he's called, knows, look, as I always say, if they pay and I'm playing. I mean, obviously, he's getting paid a ton of money. Money can convince anyone to play anywhere, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, look at Bryce Harper. I didn't think he wanted to go to Philly. I mean, again, a division rival or anything, but obviously he got that big contract. So it's nowadays, again, if you're offered the big contract, most guys are going to play. There's not a lot of guys out there that would say, I refuse, even if I'm, getting offered, hundreds of millions of dollars to go play somewhere. I don't really think of anybody that's really said that before. But now, all that being said, you talked about the health. That's the only way I can see the Mets being stopped right now. I know, first of all, everybody that says, oh, it's the Mets, they'll find a way to Mets, well, okay, fine. Under the old regime, I get that, but it's time to put that narrative to bed. I mean, and I know that won't happen until they actually, make the playoffs and go on a run or something. But this ownership group and this front office is far, far different than anything we've seen over the last decade. So, and I think the only thing that will stop them is, again, and this is realistic, but if DeGrom, has another season where he's not healthy and Scherzer is not getting any younger, so he eventually, as we saw in the playoffs, does get hurt from time to time. If those two go down, and then you get some injuries to the lineup again, then yeah, I mean, no team can survive a DeGrom and a Scherzer going down. I don't care who you are. I mean, because those are the two best pitchers in the game. So that would be what would limit them. But if they stay healthy, I don't see them being stopped. I really don't. They're definitely a 95 win team, in my opinion. I don't see any holes on the team. I mean, the offense is very solid, not spectacular, but very solid. They still have good sluggers on the team, obviously Pete Alonso. I just don't see any holes. Obviously, the bullpen, maybe you'd like to see addressed, but I'm sure that they will do that, once signings resume. But I mean, what are your predictions for this team? I think the sky's the limit, obviously.
Yeah, I think right now there's still some glaring holes with the New York Mets. I think that it kind of focuses on the pitching end of things. I mean, not getting guys like Marcus Stroman and Noah Syndergaard back definitely hurts. And even losing like Aaron Loop, Jerry Familia is still out there in free agency. I think that back end of the rotation and maybe one or two bullpen arms are really what's stopping the Mets right now. I think that 95 wins is definitely very doable for this team. I think that we've seen a lot of that talent return for this season. I think that if they can just put it together for a full season and not really be the streaky team that they were last year, I think that they can definitely hit that 95 win goal. And this new regime, there is a lot of potential there. Billy Epler's already made some nice moves as the GM. I think we talked about all those moves already. And they just hired Buck Showalter to be their new manager, and that was a signing that Max Scherzer even pushed for himself. So these new signings and that new regime definitely making some moves to keep this team as competitive as they can be.
By the way, I do want to mention, I was just reading that the Marlins were, obviously there's not really talks going on now, were in talks with Michael Conforto. So, and I don't see him coming back to New York at this point. I'd be surprised. Honestly, I think Steve Cohen would be fine with the extra draft pick that they'd get. Again, kind of keeping with his motto of wanting to sign players and compete now, but also keep restocking that farm system. And, I think this would perfectly follow his sort of game plan there by letting him go, since he's attached to that comp pick that they would get. Conforto, I have a funny feeling he stays in the NL East, though. Do you have a specific landing spot for him? Because I know there has been talk about Philly, obviously Miami now. I could even see maybe Atlanta making a play for him.
Yeah, I think all those teams make sense. I think when I was looking at just like where Conforto could go. I think Cincinnati kind of jumped out at me. I think that he really struggled on the offensive side of the bat last year, and that power just wasn't there. And I think going to Cincinnati to play for the Reds, I think that just that ballpark overall will be huge for his game. I think that maybe the Giants, they're also a team that could be in the running for another outfielder or so to kind of get them over the edge. But those are the two teams that jumped out at me. I think the NL East makes a lot of sense. Miami, I know that's been rumored, and I know it's been rumored recently, but I don't think it makes sense for Conforto to go to Miami. I think that there's definitely a hole in the outfield for sure, but if he wants to compete, I think those two teams I just named would definitely be better fits. But if Miami's offering like really good money to for Conforto to play there, I think by all means that makes a lot of sense. Now moving away from the Mets, kind of looking at some of the other signings that took place throughout the league. Going to go back to the pitchers market and move over to the AL as Kevin Gausman taking a 5-year contract with the Toronto Blue Jays, 5 years, $110 million for the for a breakout star in San Francisco last year, but now a nice 1-2 punch with himself and the recently extended Jose Barrios.
Yeah, the question will be how much, obviously the Blue Jays bought into that. The fixes that he made out in San Francisco are very real. So that'll be what's interesting. And I think San Francisco, although they hit like I think the most home runs in baseball last year or something like that, but it's generally not a hitter's paradise out in San Francisco, and he pitched well in that ballpark. It'll be interesting to see whether he goes back to being more of a middle of the rotation guy like he was in Baltimore, or if he's really made that big of a jump in San Francisco, especially this past year, and that's who he is now. I will say his strikeout numbers are far improved in his days in San Francisco. Walks are down, strikeouts are way up. And I mean, he kind of looks disgusting. I mean, when you watch him pitch, he just has such great movement, even though his fastball velocity really hasn't gone up. In fact, I think his average velocity's gone down from his Baltimore days just a tick. His off-speed stuff is really disgusting. I mean, he seemed unhittable at times last year. I think that's a great signing. Toronto has the offense, although they are missing Semien now, which will take a big dent on their offense. I think they do need to sign another bat, but pitching has been their main focus. They definitely needed some stability in that rotation outside of Ryu. And then obviously they traded for Barrios, and now they have Gausman. So they really have that 1-2-3 punch. And then they have Alek Manoah, who's another guy that's kind of emerging right now. So all of a sudden, what seemed like a weakness on that Blue Jays team is starting to, get filled. So really at this point, I know they might not have Semien next year. And obviously he had that enormous year this past year. I mean, there's no taking away from what he did. I think he broke the all-time record for home runs by a second baseman, earned that big contract in Texas. I do think they need to add another bat there in Toronto, but once they do, they might be a better all-around team than last year just because of the signing and having a full season of Barrios there. So the rotation looks better, and I do think that lineup, once you add another bat to it, will be better as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We're taking a look at this contract, Kevin Gausman getting $110 million, and you take a look at your Cy Young winning pitcher, Robbie Ray, just making $5 million more with the Seattle Mariners, and they chose to sign Gausman first. So I think the Toronto believes that they have the better pitcher in Kevin Gausman, despite having the Cy Young winner last year. And taking a look at Gausman, he had a great year in San Francisco, rebounded with the Giants. But the question with Gausman is how will he perform in the American League? Because he was there before with the Baltimore Orioles, and it did not go well. It didn't go well during his stint in the American League. So Toronto, they're going to have that risk as the earned run average isn't going to be as great as it was in San Francisco, most likely. And you mentioned it, there are still some holes in Toronto. And I was going to talk about the Semien contract next, but the fact that he's gone too, and it's not just a minor loss, it's a major loss because he was probably their best hitter outside of Vlad Guerrero Jr. It's a big hole to kind of make up, and I think that the Blue Jays are becoming a more well-rounded team. I mean, they have lacked in pitching for so long, but the fact that they now have Barrios, they now have Gausman, they now have Ryu. I think that definitely helps out overall with what the Blue Jays are trying to do and compete with teams like the Red Sox and Yankees. But is Gausman really better than Robbie Ray as he went to the Seattle Mariners on a $115 million contract? I think that still remains to be seen. Just because Robbie Ray, he did have a bounce back season just like Gausman, but he did it in the American League, which I think means just a little bit more than what Gausman did. So I think that's going to be the question that we're going to see with Gausman and see how he can pitch in Toronto. But staying with the Blue Jays and talking about the Texas Rangers now, Marcus Semien signing a $175 million contract over 7 years with the Rangers, who also added guys like Corey Seager and John Gray as well. So the Rangers have finished third worst in all of baseball, making three big moves to try and quicken up their rebuild.
Yeah, again, this is one of those teams that we talked about before that kind of is trying to move their window of contention open before it really is open. I get it. I was the one that actually back on that segment when we had our rare disagreement. I'm sure our boy Jacob Charis remembers that. I was one that actually said that I love the contract, and I still do. I just think how much does it make it competitive now? I don't know. I think down the line, it's actually a better contract in the next couple of years rather than this year per se. 26 million a year for a guy that had, what was it last year, 40 something home runs and 115 RBI, and also basically replicated his numbers from 2019 in Oakland. I mean, he seems to have figured it out. I know he had that bad 2020, but 2020 was a weird year. I mean, you look at 2 of his last 3 years, he's been the best player at that position at second base. So paying 26 million for a guy of his caliber, I don't think is an overpay at all. In fact, you could even argue to me that that could be a slight underpay. The question will be, how much does it make them competitive? I don't know. I mean, honestly, again, for 25 million, I'd have to look at Toronto's payroll. I'm kind of shocked that for that price, they didn't bring him back, because he would have been a far bigger asset to that team than he next year, at least, than he will be to Texas next year, because I'm still not expecting Texas to be that competitive next year. However, I will say this, that AL West, not that good. I mean, you look at what's happening in Houston, I don't expect them to be as good next year, especially if they lose Correa, which they might, although that doesn't look as likely as it was anymore, but I still think they will. And then obviously Seattle is getting better. The Angels are still kind of, the Angels. But other than that, that division's not that great. It's there for the taking. So, and Oakland, Oakland is going downhill. So I see why they tried to do it, Texas. So the contract itself is not bad. The timing of it is what I question.
Well, I think you mentioned the Toronto payroll, why they didn't bring back Semien. I think it's actually pretty clear, as 2 of their marquee starters in Barrios and now Kevin Gausman making big time money, and George Springer still on a big contract from last offseason. And they still have a very young lineup that they're going to have to pay very soon, i.e. Vlad Guerrero Jr. and Bo Bichette. So I think that saving money for those 2 guys was definitely very important. So I think that Semien for 25 million, I don't think it made too much sense, especially with the overall years that he got. And yeah, we had that disagreement where I didn't like the Semien contract, and I honestly still stand by it, because the Rangers, looking at where they are right now in the rebuild, they're basically just starting it. They traded away a lot of their key guys that they had. Joey Gallo was traded to the New York Yankees, probably their best player on the roster at that point, aside from Adolis Garcia, who didn't really have a great second half whatsoever. So there's a lot of questions on the Rangers, a lot of holes on the Rangers. So I don't think that signing Corey Seager, who I think is actually a great player to sign, and Marcus Semien and John Gray are going to really do much. I think that the Rangers will still be towards the bottom of the AL West. I don't think that they're going to be ready to compete in quite some time. I don't think they have the prospects to really get things going quite yet, and I still think it's going to take a while to really be competitive, especially in the American League, which already has some very talented teams as well. So I think that the Rangers, if it takes year 4, year 5 of Semien's contract to really be competitive, who knows how good he's going to be at that point? Because he's been a streaky player. Had a great 2019, had a terrible 2020, then bounced right back in 2021. We don't know if he's going to be we don't know if he's going to be consistent throughout that entire 7-year period. There's a lot of questions there. So I think that he's not going to be the best the best help. I don't think he's gonna be the best player by the time the Rangers are gonna be competitive. I think he could potentially be kind of a contract that the Rangers can't get rid of when they're trying to at a point where they're trying to make moves and be competitive. I think that overall Semien did deserve that money, just based off his performance last year, the historic performance he had. But I don't. I think it's gonna really hurt the Rangers more than help them long term.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough situation for the Rangers. Talked about their prospects. I mean, Josh Jung, who was actually the 8th overall pick in 2019, had a huge year in AA and AAA. So he might actually start at some point at third base next year. So you'll have a good infield. I mean, you'll probably start him at third, Seager at second, Semien at second. I'm sorry, Seager at shortstop, Semien at second. And then at first, they actually do have Nate Lowe now, who they got from Tampa, who last year actually hit pretty well, 264, 18 homers, not a terrible year for the first baseman. So it feels like their infield's kind of set. It's their pitching that worries me. I mean, look, John Gray was good, and I'm sure he'll improve getting him out of Colorado. It's hard to do worse outside of Colorado, just because of it's Denver. It's hard to pitch there. But the rest of that rotation is not good, barring a breakout from Spencer Howard, which I'm sure will happen because he's a former Phillies pitcher, and that's what happens when they get traded. But yeah, I do agree with what you said, that if it takes until year 4 to compete, then that's a problem. The thing is this is what the Players Association, and again, we'll talk about this when we get to the lockout. This is what they want. They want teams like a Baltimore, like a Pittsburgh, to start spending money and drive up the market. They felt that too few of teams were actually going to compete and signing players, and that was actually driving down the prices for, outside of the superstars, driving down the prices for other players. So it is good to see, to a certain extent, that other teams that might not be competing right away are still trying to sign high-level guys. I do think it's good for the sport to see a team like the Rangers try to compete. I mean, you don't have the obvious, 76ers 10-72 situation going on here, where they're out here definitely tanking. So from that standpoint, I do think it's good for the game. Is it good in the short term for the Rangers? I don't know. But again, bringing up young guys to learn under Semien and under Seager is good. You want those mentors. You want guys in the locker room that have been there, that have been, in the spotlight, have won awards, that are veterans, that know how to play at a high level and can teach the younger guys what it's like to do that, So from that standpoint, I think it's good in the longer term. I just don't think we're going to see the results this year. Maybe it'll help speed up the process, but I don't think 2022 is the year for the Rangers.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then moving down a couple of days later, staying in the infield market, and we talked about earlier on in the season, these 5 shortstops, or I think it's 5 shortstops that are going to dominate the free agency market. Saw Lindor get signed start of the season. Talked about Corey Seager, Carlos Correa still out there, Trevor Story still out there. Javier Baez, the last one, he got signed, left the New York Mets and joined the Detroit Tigers on a 6-year, $140 million contract in a deal that definitely surprised me, because in our MLB segment, I had Carlos Correa going there just because of the AJ Hinch connection. But Javier Baez going to interesting Detroit team.
So would you give Javi the thumbs down?
Honestly, I think so. I think I'll give him the thumbs down for it. It was an interesting 2 months he had with the Mets.
Yeah, the Javi Baez experience was definitely, that was something unlike anything else, because he played better in New York. Like he wasn't terrible. Like as much turmoil as they had in the Javi Baez era, and then they went on that losing streak, obviously, and the whole fans thing. But he did bounce back with them and probably earn a little bit more money on that contract with Detroit. So now Detroit is I would say, in a better situation than the Rangers, and solely because they have a couple of studs in that farm system that are going to be there soon. I had the chance to actually get to watch Riley Green and Spencer Torkelson this summer. Riley Green is an absolute stud. I mean, I watched both of them. I actually thought Riley Green, at least in the field, I mean, he really impressed me. I thought he was up there with Torkelson. I know Torkelson gets more of the attention. Torkelson can hit some tanks, though, man. I mean, he is just so strong. But you look at the way that team is going to shake out, and it's going to be a pretty good infield. I mean, it sounds like Torkelson, I don't know if they'll have him up right away. He ended the year in AAA last year. He might stay in AAA to start, but basically you figure you have Torkelson at first, Scope at second, who I think Scope is actually underrated. I know his fielding's not the best, but he's got a good bat. Shortstop, Javi Baez. So that's a pretty good three there in the infield, and then Candelario at third. So they're starting to get together a bit of a line there, and then they actually traded for Tucker Barnhart from the Reds, and he had a pretty decent year. He's decent with Cincinnati. And then on the pitching side of things, they have obviously Eduardo Rodriguez now, in addition to some of their young pitching, like Casey Mize, like Tarek Skubal, and Matt Manning. So they're definitely a team that I think is ahead a bit of the Texas Rangers. I think it's a smart move for them. Again, I like to see these kind of teams make these big moves before they're necessarily ready to compete. And I think that for Detroit, the timing was better than the timing than Texas had.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the Marcus Semien signing for Texas would have been greater 3 years from now for the Rangers. I think the Tigers waited at the exact perfect time to really make that first move to being competitive, because they still have a lot of money, because their rosters primarily of younger guys and veterans that aren't making that much. So getting a guy like Javier Baez, who is going to have a great impact in the field, going to have a great impact overall with his power, I think it's going to be a great move for Detroit. And I think the Mets, they should have made a better push to sign him back, just because they gave up a top 5 prospect in P. Crow Armstrong, a guy they drafted in the first round a couple of years ago, for just 2 months of Javier Baez. And granted, he did play pretty well in New York. He played better in New York than he did in Chicago that year. And he was a pretty big part to why the Mets lineup wasn't that bad at the trade deadline. So I think that for the Mets to lose a big prospect like that for just a short time, Javier Baez, I think would definitely hurt them. But Detroit, getting Javier Baez is going to help them out for the long term for sure. And I think this Tigers team, coming off a 500 season, I think they're going to do pretty well in the future, especially in an AL Central that's definitely on the weaker side. You're starting to see teams like Minnesota and Cleveland starting to move towards the rebuilding phase. Chicago's definitely still competing. Kansas City is also kind of rebuilding as well. So there's a huge hole there for Detroit to really contend with Chicago and really push even for a wild card spot as well. So I think all the options are there for the Tigers. And if they see a hole, they can fix it at the trade deadline, because they have younger players and they have room in cap space to really make that done. And I think that Javier Baez will definitely do very well, at least for the first couple of years of the contract.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually just looked up his numbers from New York, and this is kind of comparing apples to oranges, because it's just 47 games in New York compared to full seasons elsewhere, but he actually in New York, again, compared to full seasons, had the best on base percentage of his career by a lot. Like he had a 371 OBP. His next best was a full season in Chicago in 2018, which was 326. So he actually, again, hit well. 299, also his best batting average of his career. Who knows if he could sustain that over a full season, but he had a very good bounce back year last year after an abysmal 2020 for him. So I do agree. I think the Mets should have made a bigger push to sign him. Again, Steve Cohen does have unlimited money, it seems. So maybe he wouldn't have cared spending even more. But if it was between signing him and signing, let's say, Max Scherzer, I feel like you probably pick Max Scherzer, right? I mean, I think you'd have to.
Yeah, I think so, especially after losing guys like Marcus Stroman, who we're going to talk about next, and Noah Syndergaard. I think that was an absolute necessity there to get him back. And you already have a lot of depth in the infield if you're in New York. Guys like Jeff McNeil, maybe Robinson Cano, and J.D. Davis that can play in the infield and kind of take those reps away from what would have been Javier Baez. I think it made a lot of sense. But moving out of Marcus Stroman, and this will be the last free agent signing we talk about before moving into the lockout. But Stroman, this was honestly, I think the team that he chose is definitely a little bit surprising, at least to me. But signing a $71 million contract for 3 years with the Chicago Cubs.
Yeah, I thought for sure he was going in the NL Central and just down the road, but to St. Louis. Yeah, I don't get why Chicago. Like, I mean, here's the thing. Chicago is another one of those teams that good on them for trying to compete again. I'll like to see that, but I don't really get. I guess what they're thinking is what they saw from guys like Patrick Wisdom, Frank Schwindel, some of those guys, that they're going to be able to compete because that's the only reason I see them making this deal. And Wilson Contreras appears to think after the Yan Gomes signing that he's on the move, by the way. I remember he tweeted something out. Maybe it was like airplane emojis or something right after they signed Yan Gomes. So really weird situation in Chicago. They also got Nick Madrigal, by the way, at the deadline, who will help out at second base. So I don't really get what that team's going to be. That's one of the bigger wild cards. I mean, if those corner bats like Schwindel and Wisdom continue to hit really well, then yeah, I mean, maybe they do compete, but I don't know. It's a really like they seem like a 500 team to me. I'd be surprised if they're as bad as they were last year, finishing 71 and 91. But they also don't seem like a team that's going to compete with Milwaukee or St. Louis for the top of that division.
Yeah, I think right now, looking at the Cubs, there's 3 teams better than them. You have Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Milwaukee. So I think just looking at the division in general and just the Cubs roster, I don't think they're going to really do well at all. I think that there's a lot of holes on this Cubs roster, especially after selling at the trade deadline and trading guys like Rizzo, Bryant, and Baez all in your lineup. And you're probably going to trade Wilson Contreras as well, like you said. So for Marcus Stroman to kind of give up on really competing, I think that it's definitely it's at least strange to me because there are definitely better places that he could have gone. You mentioned St. Louis. I would have loved to see him in Seattle with the Mariners on a really young team that was coming off a great season and also just signed Robbie Ray. I think that would have been a great rotation to watch, and especially since he only got $71 million. I mean, there's definitely some wiggle room there for Stroman to have gone to a competitive team, but he just wanted to go to Wrigley Field, wanted to pitch in Chicago. I think that's the one stadium he's never pitched in his entire MLB career. Because I was looking at his Twitter, and that's something that he mentioned. But yeah, it's interesting for Stroman to kind of and this is kind of like Marcus Semien too, kind of want to play for a team that's on the rebuilding side of things, not really looking too good in terms of competitiveness for the years to come. So I think that Stroman kind of being the ace in Chicago, at least for right now. It should be fun to watch, but I don't really have hopes too high on Chicago anytime soon.
Yeah, Seattle would have been an awesome fit. I mean, pairing him, if you got him and Robbie Ray, that would have been really cool. I'm assuming Seattle's saving money for another bat. That's the only thing I can think about. Because that lineup does need a little bit of help. I mean, the offense. I know again that they had that really good season, 90 and 72 last year, but they had a lot of luck involved in that. I mean, I'd have to look up their run differential, but it was not good. Like they far outpaced what their expected wins losses were. I want to say that they were like a minus 50 run differential. Yeah, minus 51. Wow, it's close. So I would be careful there, and I think that's what they're going for, another bat. But definitely interesting. I thought that Seattle would make a run for him. I thought St. Louis would make another run for him. I thought the Mets would too, really, but it didn't seem like they were so much in on him, at least per Stroman himself. They didn't seem interested. But yeah, we'll have to see how that goes in the Windy City, but I don't have too high of expectations for that Cubs team either.
Yeah, now moving on to our kind of final segment of the day, and really where MLB overall is kind of in. And this came a couple days after the Stroman signing, but the MLB lockout officially started a couple weeks ago. It was, I believe, the ninth shutdown in the sports history, the first one since 1994. And there's really no clear sign as to when we'll see a lockout officially end and whether or not we'll see baseball in the short term future. But guys like Carlos Correa, Trevor Story, who aren't signed to a team right now, can't sign during the MLB lockout. But overall, we've expected this to come within the past couple of years or so. I know you agree with me there, Chris, but what are your overall thoughts right now on where baseball stands as a whole with this lockout?
Yeah, I mean it's tough for it's bad for the sport. I mean the whole just pettiness of it, on both sides really. I actually kind of thought it was funny that I saw a lot of the players on Twitter took down their like profile picture, which was kind of funny because I think the MLB website actually like took down the players' pictures on it. I believe I'd have to go back and look though on the roster. It's just it looks bad for the sport. Yeah, I mean, hopefully they can get a deal done. I don't feel optimistic. I mean, if you look at all, the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, and the MLB, the MLB by far has the worst relationship right now between the owners and the Players Association. What I think will happen is there's definitely going to have to be some sort of a compromise in that, I think that the players don't want a salary cap. I don't know that the owners will do that. I think that they'll still have that luxury tax, but they'll probably raise the luxury tax. The big thing that the players want and that should happen, I very much side with the players on, is that some of these guys are being held down for far too long for service time manipulation and just aren't getting paid what they should be. I mean, you look at a guy like Juan Soto. I mean, now he's getting paid more through arbitration, but in the control years, these guys are getting far, far underpaid compared to what their actual value is. Like Juan Soto should be in the top 1% of earners in baseball right now, and he's earning, I'd have to look, in the tens of millions or something, through arbitration. So a lot of the minor league guys are really, I mean, they need to get paid. Like it's actually a sin what is happening there. Just terrible. That I'm hoping the owners will cave on that. And in return, it sounds like the players will have, I think because the owners want the DH. I think that'll be coming to the NL. And I have a feeling we're going to see expanded playoffs. I think you're going to see 3 wild card teams, if I had to guess, which, by the way, I think that is the biggest motivator for teams like Texas, Detroit, and Chicago. They're thinking, hey, why not us for that last wild card spot? maybe even teams around 500 could compete for that. I mean, you look this year, the obviously the wild card teams were pretty good, but in the NL, the teams that were closest outside of St. Louis were an 83-79 Cincinnati team and an 82-80 Philadelphia team. So, they're thinking that next step down from the LA and St. Louis, like Cincy and Philly were, they think, hey, we could be a 500 team and make the playoffs now. So having that extra playoffs will help the owners obviously line their pockets with money, but also encourage teams to spend more. Those are kind of the big things that I'm seeing in terms of the CBA.
Yeah, and I think just the overall pettiness, like you mentioned, from the players, and we saw a couple people kind of change their Twitter profile to that just blank silhouette, and we see it on the MLB app with all the current players and like all the current stats. Everything that involves the current players is no longer there, and just the overall pettiness. So they did this very quickly too. It was like the second the lockout started, we saw that change, and it's hilarious because we know that there's been this rift between the Players Association and the owners for a couple of years now, and this is really seen during the COVID season when both sides really couldn't agree on how many games would be played, and we saw baseball get played a lot later than it really should have been. And you talk about the minor league. All the stuff with the minor league players and just players not getting paid as much as they should be. We saw, especially in Seattle, with guys like Jared Kelenic being held down longer than they should have, and pretty much people just saying straight up that they're holding them down just because of service time, and they want to take advantage of that. We've seen that so many times with so many different cases. I think the most notable one is Chris Bryant when he was held down by the Cubs, just trying to manipulate these players' service times for more control in the future with this team. That stuff needs to be fixed. And there's a bunch of clear issues that have been seen in baseball. The DH is definitely one. I'm a proponent of DH should be put in the National League as well. There's just so many issues in the MLB, and it's really unclear on when both sides will kind of come to an agreement and really start talking. And I guess it's a lot better than what happened in 1994. However, as that didn't stop a season, or this didn't stop a season. This is happening during the offseason. It actually made free agency a little bit more fun compared to the other years where it would take players till January and February to sign contracts. And you saw Rob Manfred kind of send out this long letter to all MLB fans the second the lockout started, kind of explaining why this happened, everything that led up to it, and the reaction that got from a lot of people was very funny as well. But I think now the question is, how quickly do you think that these players or how quickly both sides can come to an agreement, and do you think that this will affect the start of the season at all?
I hope not. Yeah, I think that it won't. I think that they'll get a deal done, but it's going to be. I think spring training will definitely be affected. I mean, I don't see them getting or anywhere close to a deal right now, and I think that if by the beginning of February, or really the end of January, if we don't see a deal done, then it definitely will start. I'll start to get concerned for the season, but spring training, if I had to guess, is going to be pretty problematic. It'll be really interesting to see because let's say that they don't get this deal done until, I don't know, like March. It's going to be chaos getting ready for the season, but also there's still a lot of big names left in free agency that, need to get signed. So there's going to be an absolute flurry of activity as soon as the new CBA gets agreed to, that guys like Carlos Correa and, Clayton Kershaw and all them are going to have to sign and report to spring training very quickly. I mean, now, obviously, it won't be as crunched of a timeline if they get everything done in January, but if it takes a while, then you're going to see another window like we had at the end of November, where it was like rapid fire signings. You're going to see that again if they don't get this done until around spring training, because this is why we saw a lot of guys sign in November. They don't know how long this lockout's going to take. They want to, be entrenched in their new city and be ready for spring training in the case that this lockout isn't over until March and they have to go right to spring training. So for the guys that didn't sign, it's kind of a disadvantage right now because you might have like a week or two to negotiate and have to get to spring training like immediately if this thing is as delayed as it could be. But I'm hopeful that the season will start on time. Right now, we're still early enough that I think it should.
Yeah, I agree. We really haven't seen much about both sides kind of talking it out. We haven't really seen those conversations start yet, but I still have hope that we'll see those conversations kind of take place within the next couple of weeks or so, and hopefully we'll see a normal spring training and a normal regular season. Just being optimistic here, but yeah, there's a lot for both sides to really hash out. So it'll be interesting to see, especially when the lockout does end, what players like Correa and Story will do once the season will start. Before we wrap up here, we talked a lot about the lockout. Before that, we talked about kind of free agency signings. But Chris, if you had to pick a winner and a loser from these past couple of weeks in a very hyper fast off season, where would you go with that?
Yeah, again, I would give these are kind of like mid-off season grades. Obviously, a lot of these rosters, really all of them, are not complete. I'll leave the obvious choice to you. It's you're wearing the jersey, it's your guys, so I'll leave that one to you. I think. All right, if I'm gonna go with a loser, I'm gonna be biased, and I got to go with the Philadelphia Phillies here. Um, my man John Middleton, Mr. Stupid Money. Got to wake up because everybody is lapping you in the NL East. I mean, the Miami Marlins haven't had a bad offseason either. The Mets obviously spent my God, they have like the reincarnation of like Steve Jobs or whatever as the owner. Actually, he might even be richer than Steve Jobs. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, the Phillies did really nothing. They signed a relief pitcher. Yeah, I mean, they have to get going. They're my obvious loser, I would say, so far. Um, I would say it actually would have been the Dodgers, but they did re-sign Chris Taylor, so I'll give them benefit of the doubt. In terms of a winner, actually another loser I would say is the Yankees in the AL. Winners, I would say, all right, I'll go with, let's see here. Really not, I would say, all right, I'm going to go with Detroit actually, because I kind of like what they did, especially tying it in with their rebuild. I think that was a good job. And then I'm going to go with, I guess, in the NL, not a lot of other teams did anything besides the Mets. So I'm actually going to go with the Miami Marlins. I think that they did a good job with a couple good signings there. Obviously, the Sandy Alcantara deal was an absolute steal. 5 years for $56 million. We didn't really get into that, but he's an awesome pitcher, deserved a lot more money than that at only 26 years old. Avisail Garcia, a good bat there. And it seems like they're interested in a lot of other names like Kyle Schwarber and who else? Obviously Conforto. So I like what they're doing down in Miami. I would say that they are probably my other winner, but I'll give you the obvious choice in the NL.
And starting out with those winners, it's all about the Mets. It's all about the Mets this offseason. And we talked about the signings that they made earlier on in the podcast, but adding a good number two, possibly number one pitcher in Max Scherzer, a guy that can give the Mets really solid outings and be one of the top pitchers in the game. Getting Starling Marte, a guy that brings a good amount of speed, good amount of defense in the outfield, which is something the Mets have not had a lot of. Getting a guy like Mark Canha, who also has a good amount of power in the outfield as well. And even Escobar, too. He can give you 20 home runs or so, hit around 250, and be a reliable infielder, which is something the Mets are looking for, too. Getting four reliable guys and also getting a decent manager in Buck Showalter, a guy that a lot of players seem to like, especially Max Scherzer. So I think that a lot of these moves are going to work out, and the Mets are starting to move into the right direction here overall. So I think things are looking up for the Mets. And That kind of brings me to my loser of the offseason with the Oakland A's. As I mentioned, they lost both Starling Marte and Mark Canha to the New York Mets, but they also lost Bob Melvin, their manager, moving from the A's to the Padres. So the A's not really getting a lot better overall. And this is a team that just missed the playoffs in the AL too. So they're having trade rumors with guys like Matt Olson and Matt Chapman. Haven't done much yet aside from losing a lot of those key guys. And the A's are starting to get worse, starting to fall out of it. And what is a very weak AL West division? I mean, the Astros aren't really getting a lot better. The Mariners are, and you don't really know what the Rangers are really thinking over there. You don't know how great they're going to be. So with the A's struggling here, there's a lot of questions. They just hired a new manager a couple days ago, but there's a lot of holes, especially in the outfield, that they're going to have to fill. So with that, that is going to wrap up another edition of Top Prospects. We'll hopefully we won't take another long break like we did last time, and we'll keep you updated with the lockout and a few more free agency signings once the lockout does end. But for Chris Lemmo, I'm Logan Bourandas, and have a great day.